Okay, our next speaker is Stephen Camarota, and Steve is the Director of Research at the Center for Immigration Studies. He's been with the center since 1996, and his area of expertise is economics and demographics. Steve holds a PhD from the University of Virginia in public policy analysis and a master's degree in political science from the University of Pennsylvania. Today, Steve is going to be discussing the impact of immigration on population size. Thank you, Steve, for joining us.
When they invited me here, and I want to thank them for doing that, they asked me to focus on the issue of, what is the impact of immigration on U.S. population size? It's an important question. It's worth thinking about for all the reasons, and others have touched on this. So I try not to rehash too much, but let's talk about it a little bit. Now I get to try this new thing out here. Okay, it worked. Good. And this is also the first slide in the handout. Immigration is a key factor in U.S. population growth. Let's be clear on that point. At the end of this decade, it looks like about 1.3 million new legal and illegal immigrants are settling in the United States each year. So that's quite a lot of folks. And so it was higher, actually, earlier in this decade, probably more like 1.5 million, maybe even as high as 1.6 million. But it's fallen primarily because illegal immigration seems to be down. There are fewer illegal immigrants coming. And so that seems to be gone. Our legal immigration system is kind of running at full tilt, especially the permanent part of it. That's the green cards. That's over 1 million people a year. And that's been pretty consistent throughout the entire decade of the most recent decade. So every year, about 1 million folks continue to settle in the United States permanently. And then we have the temporary categories, and then we have illegal immigration. Now, remember, people move from categories. That's why we think about 1.3 million new arrivals at the end of the decade, because somebody goes from being an illegal immigrant to a permanent immigrant. Happens all the time, maybe 200,000 people a year. Lots of people go from being a temporary immigrant, or a non-immigrant is actually the term, to being a permanent immigrant. That, again, they get their green card. So the total number of new folks is about 1.3 million. When the economy recovers, that number, again, will probably go up to about 1.5 million. Now, in addition to that, there are now about 900,000 births to immigrants in the United States. This is about a little bit less than 1 out of every 4 births in the United States. There's somewhat over 4 million births total in the United States. And so about 23-24% are to a mother who is foreign born, that is an immigrant, legal or illegal. There's some debate, but 8 to 10% of all births in the United States are to illegal immigrants. About 10 to 13% or 14% are to legal immigrants, and then the rest are to the native-born population. Now, that 1.3 plus 900,000 is important because the total population in the United States at the end of this decade is growing, according to the Census Bureau, though we'll get a more definitive answer when the census results come out, is growing by about 2.6, 2.7 million people. So if you add the number of new arrivals plus the number of births to immigrants right now, you get somewhere around 3/4, maybe 80% of the total U.S. population growth is directly attributable to new arrivals and births to immigrants. So it's a really big share, but it's not the whole story. U.S. population does grow even if there was no immigration, but it wouldn't grow very much. So that's what these numbers tell us. They're important. So maybe think of it this way. Each decade recently, the U.S., and this most recent decade will show something like this, grows by about 30 million people. This decade looks like it's going to be about 29 million. The previous decade was more like 31, or was it closer to 32 million? So if you've got 15 or 13 million immigrants arriving, and you've got something like 4 or 5 million births to immigrants each decade, you can see that it's going to make up the overwhelming fraction of your population growth. Let's take a look at my projections, which are a little easier to understand than the Census Bureau's. And that's on the next slide, which I'll go to now. This just shows a couple different scenarios. The one in the middle is the one sort of we're headed on for 2060. And it is about 464 million. We have about 310 million people in the United States today. So you're looking at growth of at least 150 million. The bottom one is my zero projection. Now, this is basically zero immigration. You can model this in different ways as it's zero net. These other two figures are net immigration. So if you have net immigration of 1.2, that's the difference between the kind of comings and goings of folks. It means that it assumes your immigration is more like 1.4 new folks. So a little higher than we've actually gotten in the last 2 years, but pretty much the average for most of this decade. So this gives us an idea of where we're headed. And these are relatively conservative, widely agreed upon. No one's sort of disagrees. We're headed to add about 150 million people, or somewhat more than that, over the next 50 years. So that's quite a lot of folks. About, roughly speaking, something like 30 million people a decade. What else we can see from this chart is sort of the immigration impact. Moving into the future, these gives us an idea by looking at my zero projection with zero immigration, with what I think is going to happen, or a relatively reasonable but somewhat conservative. It's around 100 million. If you think about the impact of immigration over the next 50 years, it's nice to have a round figure. It's going to add about 100 million to the U.S. population. Or put a different way, the difference between if we had no immigration as to what, or if we sort of continue on the current track, is about 100 million or 100 million more. Now remember, this is immigrants who have not come, but who will come, plus the descendants that they'll have. It doesn't include any of the births going on right now to the immigrants already here. Now you could cut the number, that 365 can be cut by about 20 million if all the illegal immigrants went home right now and didn't return. And the children they've already had in the United States stayed. So, the future impact of the illegal immigrants is not trivial. They're going to have children, and those children have relatively high fertility rates. So, if you could send some large fraction of the illegal immigrant population home, you would also impact these numbers in the future. The assumption here, of course, is all the legal immigrants basically stay, except for that natural out-migration of folks that always, of course, occurs. Now, the Census Bureau actually has some projections. Phil put some projections that I actually like better, but they're much older, up on the board, where they explain themselves. The new Census Bureau projections have very little methodology with them that's detailed. We don't know exactly what they're assuming. It is striking that they've had them out for 2 years, and demographers are still left wondering. But let me show you what they have. So you can see it up here. And again, it's also slide number 4 in your handout. They only go to 2050. And they're saying about 439 by 2050. And if you kind of assume, a regular progression on, you'd get to about 465, maybe 470 by 2060. So very similar to my projections. You could see, the thing of it is the Bureau doesn't assume a steady level of immigration. They assume a level, and then they assume it goes up from there. So basically their middle range projection, which is the dark line at 439 by 2050, assumes that it's about 1.2 now, but that it's going over the course of this decade to gradually but very steadily increase to 2.1 million. So by the end, in 2040, for example, it's around 2 million, and then by the very end it's 2.1, but it just increases gradually throughout the decade. Are they right? Well, certainly, as many of you probably know, immigration has been increasing. The general trend, despite the last 2 or 3 years, is for immigration to go up, 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 and up. So it's a reasonable projection. They also have, fascinatingly, a zero immigration projection, what I've put in here. You see that 323? I have to tell you, it makes no sense to me. The methodology is not well explained. Even the starting figures don't make sense to me. But you have it here. It's from the Bureau. You can go get it from their website as well. And so Their estimate is over 100 million impact between zero immigration and what they think is the sort of most likely scenario. You add, and then the top line just shows what would happen. Oh, I should use this little pointer. This is kind of neat. Yeah.
Zero immigration, zero net.
The Census Bureau is not made clear on their website exactly what zero is. In emailing and talking to people, it seems, and I want to use that word, that it is zero. It's just zero immigration. They're assuming a certain outmigration of people, but no new immigration. But having not clearly stated that on their website, and not being absolutely certain of that, you have to understand, I think this is a real issue. But at least it gives us an idea of the scale of the impact of future immigration. Again, these are immigrants who have not yet come, but who will come, plus the children and grandchildren and so forth that they'll have, and they're estimating somewhat over 100 million more people. So the reason I think it's important to have the Bureau's estimates here and mine is to try to communicate with you that there isn't that much debate. Immigration is the main factor driving U.S. population growth, and at least sometime over the next 50 or 60 years, maybe even less if the Bureau's poorly explained but interesting projections are right, maybe more than 100 million people. So if you want a good summary statistic, again, the one I want to leave you with is 100 million. I actually titled the report of my projections, was called 100 million more. I'm working on new ones. It's a real challenge because the Bureau hasn't explained exactly what it's done with fertility.